My name is Lakeisha Fanai. Would you please give an example of an important case decided by the Supreme Court that speaks to the issue of separation of powers?
Of course, the Supreme Court over the years has had many, many cases involving the separation of powers, and we often think of the more recent cases involving the Guantanamo detainees as separation of powers. But I'd like instead to go back in time in history to more than 50 years ago to what is known as the Steele seizure case, also known as the Youngstown sheet and tube case. To set it in time, it's 1952, it's the height of the Korean War. Of course, steel is critical to the war effort. The steel mills threatened at that time to go on strike. President Truman was very concerned that if the mills went on strike, that the country would not have the resources necessary to have an effective and complete military effort. So under his emergency powers, he stepped in and in effect seized the steel mills under federal authority. It didn't take long, however, for the Supreme Court to then step in. And the Supreme Court was quite clear that the president had overstepped his bounds. They said basically the president's role is to enforce the law. He's not a lawmaker. And that in seizing the mills, he had basically exceeded his presidential powers. Now that case is seen as a somewhat very rare example of where the court stepped in and said to the president, even though it's a time of war, you don't have the power to step in. You have a certain role, the courts have a certain role, and the legislature has a certain role.
The case that comes to mind concerning separation of powers is the case of United States versus Nixon. That arose out of the Watergate scandal in 1974. The special prosecutor who had been appointed sought through a subpoena to get certain tapes that were the result of conversations that had occurred within the Oval Office. The President of the United States, Richard Nixon, resisted that subpoena. He cited broadly executive power, not specific to diplomatic or military or national security, but just that any conversation should be kept confidential. The Supreme Court of the United States refused to quash the subpoena. The Supreme Court said that to do that would interfere with separation of powers, and in particular the administration of the criminal justice system by the federal courts. It utilized the oft-stated phrase that no man, not even the President of the United States, is above the law. And the upshot of that decision was that the President did not have the veto power over the Supreme Court, and President Nixon turned over the tapes.
2006 in Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. That case involved one of the many Guantanamo detainees who was apprehended during the beginning of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was charged with a conspiracy offense to be tried by a military commission established by President Bush, and he filed a habeas corpus action in federal district court claiming that conspiracy offense was not triable by a military commission for a lot of various reasons. While that case was pending, the district court granted habeas relief, but then Congress passed the Military Detainee Act, which purported to streamline all legal attacks by Guantanamo detainees on their detention. And it also purported to provide, in part, that no court or judge or justice was to hear any further attacks by Guantanamo detainees through habeas jurisdiction. And the whole question, at least one of the big questions in front of the Supreme Court, was whether or not that act had stripped the federal courts of jurisdiction of an ongoing case. And the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that it did not by a 5-3 vote. But I think that case raised separation of powers issues because it involved the President and Congress trying to limit the authority and jurisdiction of federal courts in habeas cases that were already pending, which is obviously usually a separation of powers issue. And then it also raised the ability of a federal court like the Supreme Court to limit the meaning of a federal law so as to not allow for the stripping of jurisdiction.